Picture this, a dim, overcrowded cell beneath the streets of ancient Rome, where the air is thick with the scent of sweat and desperation. Chains clink in the darkness, but if you listen closely, you'll hear something unexpected, the hushed whispers of trade. A piece of bread exchanged for a scrap of cloth, a stolen coin bartered for a sip of wine. This wasn't just a prison, it was a marketplace. Behind bars, a hidden economy thrived, one where prisoners turned survival into an art form, trading goods under the very noses of their guards. But here's the twist. This shadowy system didn't just benefit the inmates. It lined the pockets of people far beyond those prison walls, people with power, influence, and a vested interest in keeping this secret economy alive. Who were these unseen players pulling the strings? How did a place designed for punishment become a hotbed of clandestine commerce? The answer lies in the gritty reality of ancient prisons, where the lines between captor and capitalist blurred. From Rome to Byzantium, prisons weren't just dungeons of despair. They were engines of profit, fueling a network of corruption that reached the highest echelons of society. Guards took cuts of every trade, officials turned a blind eye for the right price, and even wealthy elites invested in this underground system, reaping rewards from the misery of the incarcerated. So why does this matter today? Because the hidden economy of ancient prisons reveals a truth about human nature that still echoes through time. Where there's suffering, there's often someone profiting from it. Over the next few minutes, we'll unravel this forgotten chapter of history, tracing the threads of greed and ingenuity that wove together the lives of prisoners, guards, and the shadowy figures who benefited most. You'll discover how breadcrumbs of evidence left behind scraps of parchment, long-buried ledgers, and cryptic inscriptions paint a picture of a system far more complex than simple punishment. This is a story of survival, exploitation, and the unexpected ways power operates in the darkest corners of society. Ready to step into the shadows? Let's begin. The story of prison economies begins far earlier than you might think, long before the grand dungeons of Rome, in the dusty corridors of Mesopotamia's earliest jails. Picture a cramped cell in ancient Babylon where a farmer imprisoned for debt swaps his last piece of bread for a chipped clay cup. It's a small act, but it reveals a profound truth. Even in captivity, humans will find ways to trade. Archaeologists have uncovered tiny clay tokens in these ruins, marked with symbols that match records of prison rations. These weren't just scraps, they were currency, proof that prisoners bartered necessities to survive. But it wasn't just Mesopotamia. In Egypt, papyrus scrolls detail how laborers building the pyramids, trapped in work camps, traded extra tools for better rations. A chisel for an extra loaf, a hammer for a sip of beer. These exchanges weren't random. They followed rules, unspoken codes that turned desperation into order. Over time, these small acts of survival grew into something bigger. Networks formed, favors were banked. A prisoner with a skill, like mending sandals or carving wood, could trade their talents for protection or comfort. What started as simple swaps became a shadowy system, almost like a marketplace behind bars. And here's where things get interesting. These economies didn't stay hidden. Guards noticed, officials noticed. Instead of shutting them down, many turned a blind eye for a price, a cut of the trades, a bribe to ignore the whispers. Suddenly, the very people meant to enforce order became middlemen, profiting from the system they were supposed to control. But the biggest players, they were outside the walls. Wealthy merchants, corrupt officials, even temple priests, all found ways to tap into this underground flow of goods and favors. A prisoner's traded cup might end up sold in a market, the profits funneled back to someone in power. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about exploitation. The origins of prison economies show us how quickly necessity can turn into opportunity for some. And as these systems grew, so did their reach, weaving a web that connected the darkest cells to the highest halls of power. But how did it spread? That's where the story takes an even darker turn. Guards didn't just watch these shadowy prison markets, they became the gatekeepers. In ancient Rome, a prisoner handing over a stolen ring to a guard wasn't just bribing for freedom, they were paying a transaction fee. Historical records from Pompeii's prison cells describe guards charging a tax on every trade, taking a cut of bread, a sip of wine, even a share of handmade goods. One tablet found near the Colosseum details a guard's ledger, listing payments from inmates like a shopkeeper tracking sales, but it wasn't always this blatant. In Greece, playwrights like Aristophanes mocked the system in comedies, portraying guards as haggling merchants, weighing stolen olives against promises of extra blankets. Why did officials let this corruption flourish? The answer lies in control. A prisoner with something to lose, a hidden stash of coins, a prized tool, was easier to manage. Guards knew that cracking down on the trade would spark riots, so they allowed just enough bartering to keep desperation at bay. But there was another reason: greed. Roman military dispatches reveal how entire guard units auctioned smuggling rights to the highest bidder. A wealthy inmate might pay a guard to sneak in fine wine or fresh fruit, while poorer prisoners traded scraps of their own rations for protection. The system became so entrenched that some guards earned more from these side deals than their official wages, and then there were the truly brazen ones. In Alexandria, a papyrus from the 2nd century describes a guard who smuggled luxury goods, perfumes, silk, even exotic spices right under the warden's nose. When caught, his defense was chillingly simple: everyone does it. That casual admission exposes the scale of the problem. Corruption wasn't the exception, it was the rule. But the guards were just pawns in a larger game. Higher up the chain, officials quietly skimmed profits, turning prisons into revenue streams. Tax records from Byzantium show prison complexes listed as profitable enterprises, their earnings mysteriously matching shortages in inmate rations. This wasn't chaos, it was a carefully balanced ecosystem of exploitation. Guards played both sides, keeping order while lining their pockets, and the people in power let it happen because they benefited too. But the real shock, the ones pulling the strings, weren't even in the prisons. They were the wealthy elites, the merchants, the politicians who treated human misery as an investment opportunity. And their schemes went far beyond a few smuggled loaves of bread. The true scale of ancient prison exploitation becomes clear when we look beyond the shadowy barter systems and into the cold, calculated use of forced labor. Imagine the pyramids of Egypt rising under the desert sun, not built by slaves in chains, as Hollywood often shows, but by a workforce heavily populated by prisoners. These weren't just common criminals. Many were debtors, political dissidents, or even farmers who'd failed to pay taxes, all pressed into service as a form of repayment to the state. Papyrus records from the reign of Pharaoh Djoser reveal meticulous accounting. So many prisoners assigned to quarry stone, so many to haul blocks, all under the watchful eyes of overseers who tallied their progress like livestock. The work was brutal, but the system was ruthlessly efficient. A single season of labor could erase a debt if the prisoner survived. This wasn't unique to Egypt. In ancient China, the Qin dynasty transformed punishment into productivity on an industrial scale. Thousands of convicts, many convicted of minor offenses like petty theft or disrespecting local officials, were shipped to penal colonies in the frontier. There they mined iron, forged weapons, or built sections of the Great Wall. Han Dynasty records describe entire battalions of prisoners clad in red, the color marking them as convict labor hauling stones up mountain passes. The state didn't just punish these men, it monetized them. Every axe head forged, every mile of wall raised enriched the empire, and if a prisoner died, their family was often billed for the cost of replacing them. Rome took this exploitation to another level entirely. The empire's infamous silver mines at Lorient were hell on earth, where prisoners worked in pitch-dark tunnels, breathing toxic fumes until their lungs failed. Historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that the mines consumed men like lamps burning oil, with fresh convicts shipped in as others perished. But here's the twist: Rome didn't just use its own prisoners. Conquered rebels, pirates, even entire communities sentenced to mass enslavement after uprisings were funneled into these death traps. The silver extracted bankrolled Rome's armies, its monuments, its lavish elite, all built on the backs of those who'd never see a coin of the profits they generated. Did any of these systems offer fair compensation? Rarely. In Babylon, a cuneiform tablet lists a prisoner's wages as a daily ration of beer and bread barely enough to survive. In Persia, some skilled prisoners, like stonemasons or scribes, could earn small privileges, but only if their work pleased overseers. The grim reality. Most ancient states viewed prisoners not as humans, but as disposable tools. Their labor was a resource to be extracted, like timber or ore, until it was exhausted. Yet the most unsettling part isn't the state's role. It's how private actors got in on the action. In Rome, wealthy patricians leased prison labor from the state for private projects, paying per head like renting equipment. A senator's villa, a merchant's warehouse, even a gladiator school's construction might be staffed by convicts, their suffering outsourced to the highest bidder. In India, the Mauryan Empire allowed private landowners to sponsor prisoners, using them to clear fields or dig irrigation ditches in exchange for a cut of the harvest. This wasn't just punishment, it was privatization of human misery. The line between justice and profit had vanished entirely. From the quarries of Egypt to the mines of Spain, ancient prisons weren't just holding cells, they were factories without walls where the condemned became commodities. And as we'll see next, this system didn't just enrich the powerful, it reshaped entire economies, leaving scars that still echo in modern labor practices today. Beyond the prison walls, another shadowy network thrived, one that turned incarceration into a booming business for outside merchants. Picture a caravan stopping at a Roman prison under cover of night, its crates packed not with grain or tools, but with silks from China, spices from India, and fine wines from Gaul, all destined for the cells. These weren't humanitarian deliveries, they were black market supply chains, meticulously organized to profit from prisoners' desperation. A single cup of wine could sell for 10 times its street value inside those walls, and merchants knew it. Silk Road traders were especially notorious for this. A scrap of parchment found in a Constantinople jail lists exotic goods smuggled in through guard bribes, Persian dates, Egyptian linen, even delicate glassware from Antioch. But luxury items were just the beginning. Dig deeper into court records from Tang Dynasty China, and you'll find merchants arrested for supplying prisoners with smuggled knives, poison, even forged release documents, all for the right price. One audacious case in Chang'an involved a merchant disguising weapons as Buddhist prayer scrolls, exploiting the guards' reluctance to search sacred objects. How did these deals even happen? Through a web of alliances that blurred the line between keeper and criminal. guards acted as middlemen, taking cuts from merchants in exchange for turning a blind eye. In Rome, a guard's diary recovered from Pompeii details his weekly gifts from local wine sellers' amphorae left near the prison's back gate, their contents quietly distributed to wealthy inmates. Meanwhile, prisoners with outside connections became vital links. A letter from a Byzantine jail reveals how a former silk merchant, locked up for debt, used his old trade contacts to arrange deliveries, earning himself better rations and protection. The risks were enormous. In medieval Europe, merchants caught smuggling faced the same prisons they supplied, or worse. A 13th century Parisian ledger records a spice trader publicly hanged with the contraband pepper sacks still tied around his neck. Yet the rewards kept the trade alive. Some merchants grew rich enough to bribe judges, ensuring their operations continued unchecked. But the most shocking players weren't the merchants or even the guards. They were the elites, aristocrats, bankers, even clergy who quietly funded these operations, treating prisons as investment opportunities. Next, we'll uncover how the wealthy turned human captivity into a portfolio. The real architects of ancient prison economies weren't the guards or merchants. They were the political elites lurking in marble halls, far from the stench of dungeon cells. Take the Roman senator Lucius Calpurnius Piso, whose name appears on a 1st century ledger alongside a staggering detail: ownership of 3 limestone quarries near Naples, all staffed entirely by prison labor. This wasn't charity, it was cold calculation. Prisoners sentenced to hard labor were leased to Piso by the state, their backs breaking under the sun while his coffers swelled. And he was far from alone. Papyrus records from Egypt reveal wealthy officials like the prefect Petronius Arbiter doing the same, using prisoners to dredge canals and harvest flax profits flowing straight into their estates. But how did these elites hide their exploitation behind a veneer of respectability? Money laundering, ancient style. In Rome, senators funneled prison-generated wealth through legitimate businesses. A quarry's output might be sold to a front company at a laughably low price, only to be resold at market value. Chinese letter pocketed tax-free. A recently deciphered tablet from Pompeii outlines one such scheme. A senator's cousin purchased iron ore mined by prisoners for a pittance, then exported it to Gaul under a different name, netting a fortune. Even emperors participated. Nero's infamous Golden House was built partly with marble quarried by convicts, their labor costs erased from official accounts. The parallels to modern power structures are unsettling. Just as Roman elites profited from prison labor while publicly decrying crime, today's systems often see marginalized communities funneled into low-wage prison jobs. Think of U.S. inmates fighting wildfires for dollars a day, or corporations exploiting prison labor for manufacturing. The mechanisms may have evolved, but the pattern remains, those in power finding ways to monetize punishment. And then there were the religious institutions, shockingly complicit in this trade. In Babylon, temple priests leased prisoners to work sacred lands, citing divine mandate. A cuneiform receipt from the Esagila temple lists 30 prisoners harvesting barley, their output tallied as offerings, though temple granaries mysteriously overflowed. Medieval European monasteries were even bolder. Chronicles from Cluny Abbey describe abbots accepting prisoners as donations from nobles, then putting them to work copying manuscripts or brewing ale, the proceeds funding lavish renovations. In Byzantium, church-run prisons doubled as workshops, weaving silk for ecclesiastical vestments sold at premium prices. The holiest institutions had become middlemen in human suffering, their ledgers recording souls alongside sacks of grain. And as this unholy alliance between power, profit, and punishment tightened its grip, one question lingered: who, in the end, truly paid the price. The grand temples of Babylon gleamed under the desert sun, their towering ziggurats built not just by devout craftsmen, but by hands shackled in chains. Beneath the sacred veneer of these holy sites lay a ruthless truth: religion had become another tool of exploitation. A cuneiform tablet from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II details the allocation of prisoners to construction crews, their labor described as offerings to Marduk. These weren't volunteers, they were captives of war, debtors, or political enemies, forced to haul bricks under the lash of overseers who carried temple seals. The same priests who preached divine mercy kept meticulous records of productivity, noting how many bricks each prisoner laid before collapsing from exhaustion. But the hypocrisy ran deeper. Inside temple complexes, priests operated a twisted marketplace of salvation. Wealthy inmates could purchase divine favors, amulets blessed in secret ceremonies, prayers whispered to judges, even forged omens predicting early release. A Babylonian contract tablet, now housed in the British Museum, records a staggering transaction. A merchant imprisoned for fraud paid 6 silver shekels, a year's wages for a laborer, for a priest to declare his crimes washed away by the gods. The catch: the priest's verdict held no legal weight. It was pure theater, a con disguised as piety. Artifacts expose this sacred shakedown in chilling detail. Excavations near the Esagila temple uncovered tiny clay tokens marked with cell numbers and amounts receipts for bribes disguised as temple donations. One reads, "For the mercy of Shamash, 2 shekels from cell 12. Another lists payments in barley and oil from prisoners' families, promising intercession with guards. The most damning evidence comes from a priest's private ledger, its entries alternating between temple supplies and prisoner quotas. 50 jars of sacred oil delivered, 20 laborers transferred to the granary. Faith had become a ledger, salvation a line item. How did the priests justify this? They cloaked exploitation in ritual. A prisoner's labor became service to the gods. Their bribes were offerings. Even the act of selling favors was framed as divinely sanctioned, a twisted form of alchemy turning human suffering into temple gold. But cracks in this holy facade occasionally appeared. A fragmentary letter from a disgraced temple scribe admits the truth. When the warden demands his share, we call it Marduk's tithe. Yet amid this moral rot, flickers of defiance emerged. Scratched into the bricks of a Babylonian cell block are crude drawings of priests with animal heads, their bodies pierced by spears. A smuggled prayer tablet curses a temple official by name, invoking demons instead of gods. These weren't just acts of anger, they were the first sparks of resistance. And as we'll see, where oppression ran deepest, ingenuity flourished in unexpected ways. Oppression breeds defiance, and nowhere was this clearer than in the prisoner revolts that shook ancient empires to their core. Take the Sicilian slave revolts of the 2nd century before the Common Era, where thousands of enslaved miners and field workers turned their tools into weapons. These weren't random riots, they were meticulously organized uprisings. Eunice, a former slave turned rebel leader, minted his own coins bearing the title King Antiochus, a direct challenge to Rome's authority. His followers, many of them prisoners of war, forged armor from stolen metal and carved makeshift swords from mining equipment. For years, they held entire regions hostage, burning estates and freeing laborers until Rome was forced to divert legions from distant wars, a financial blow that drained imperial coffers and exposed the fragility of their exploitative system. But Sicily was just the beginning. In ancient India, the Mauryan Empire faced repeated revolts in its notorious Rakshasa Griha prisons, where political dissidents were held. Sanskrit scrolls describe how inmates dug tunnels with stolen utensils, timing their escapes during monsoon floods to mask the noise. One particularly audacious uprising in Pataliputra saw prisoners overpower guards with chains, then seize control of the city's granaries, a tactical move that starved the local garrison into surrender. Meanwhile, in Persia's salt mines, Zoroastrian texts tell of prisoners staging silent strikes, refusing to work until overseers met their demands for better rations. These weren't just acts of desperation, they were calculated protests that disrupted entire supply chains. The economic toll of these rebellions was staggering. When prisoners in Athens' silver mines revolted in 458 before the Common Era, production halted for months. Tax records show the city's revenue plummeted by nearly half, forcing leaders to levy emergency taxes on citizens. Similarly, when Qin dynasty convicts sabotaged sections of the Great Wall, the cost of repairs reportedly equaled the empire's annual military budget. These uprisings exposed a bitter irony. The very systems designed to profit from prisoners often bankrupted their captors when pushed too far. Yet amid the chaos, prisons became unlikely hubs of innovation. Shackled minds found ingenious ways to resist. Roman prisoners developed coded tap systems to communicate through walls, while Byzantine inmates smuggled messages in hollowed-out bread loaves. In China, dissidents imprisoned for forging currency perfected their craft behind bars, creating counterfeit coins so flawless they circulated undetected for years. Even the tools of oppression were repurposed. Egyptian prisoners turned quarry shackles into plumb lines for secret tunneling projects, and medieval European convicts wove escape ropes from torn prison garb. The greatest innovation, though, was solidarity. From whispered alliances in Babylonian cells to the elaborate networks of the Sicilian revolts, prisoners transformed isolation into collective power. Their defiance proved a universal truth. No system of exploitation, no matter how ruthless, could extinguish the human instinct to fight back, and sometimes to win. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and nowhere was this more brutally true than behind ancient prison bars. Imagine a medieval scribe, his fingers stained with ink, etching tiny symbols into the leather binding of a prayer book. To his jailers, it looked like devotion. In reality, he was crafting a cipher, embedding escape plans within psalms. This wasn't just survival, it was cryptography born in chains. Across cultures and eras, prisoners transformed their constraints into catalysts for innovation, turning everyday objects into tools of resistance. In Roman jails, inmates reprusted spoons into lockpicks, while Byzantine prisoners wove ropes from torn tunics, lowering themselves from tower cells under cover of night. The very items meant to restrict them became keys to freedom, but some creations went beyond escape. Take the intricate prison lace of Renaissance Italy, delicate textiles woven by female inmates from stolen thread, smuggled out and sold in noble courts. These weren't just crafts, they were covert currencies, funding legal appeals or bribes. Similarly, Tang dynasty prisoners in China perfected miniature ivory carvings, traded through guards to outside collectors. A single figurine could buy extra rations or protection. Even punishment-inspired art. Siberian exiles in the 17th century etched elaborate scenes onto birch bark with burnt sticks, creating a black market trade in prison icons that still surfaces in museums today. The most startling innovations, though, emerged from sheer desperation. In the salt mines of Carthage, enslaved rebels devised a signaling system using hammer strikes, an early Morse code relaying revolt plans across caverns. Ottoman prisoners jailed for debt invented a shadow accounting system, tracking loans and interest on smuggled parchment scraps, a practice so efficient it influenced early banking ledgers. And in the bowels of London's Newgate prison, 18th century inmates minted counterfeit coins from melted buttons, flooding the economy with prison pennies, so convincing they destabilized local markets. Here's the paradox: oppression didn't just crush creativity, it forced ingenuity to flourish in the darkest corners. When every spoon could be a tool, every scrap a canvas, and every whisper a code, survival demanded invention. But this raises a darker question. Did the very systems designed to break spirits inadvertently accelerate progress? The answer lies not just in what prisoners made, but who controlled the fruits of their labor, a tension that sharpened when gender entered the equation. Women in ancient prisons faced a double bind, constrained by bars and societal expectations. Yet their stories reveal how exploitation and resilience collided in ways that reshaped economies both inside and beyond the walls. Women in ancient prisons faced a reality far harsher than their male counterparts, yet their stories reveal a hidden resilience that reshaped prison economies from the inside. In Assyria, clay tablets from Nineveh's royal archives detail female prisoners forced into textile workshops, spinning wool and weaving fabrics for the palace. But here's what the records omit: these women didn't just labor silently. They bartered their skills, trading finely woven belts or dyed cloth for extra rations, medicine, even favors from guards. One tablet cryptically notes a prisoner named Beltane acquiring 3 copper rings, despite her meager official wages, proof of an underground trade flourishing beneath official scrutiny. Athens presented a grimmer picture. Court speeches from the 4th century before the Common Era describe women imprisoned for debt or adultery, their bodies commodified in ways men rarely experienced. A speech by the orator Lysias chillingly recounts how guards rented out female inmates to wealthy citizens, disguising the transactions as visitation rights. Yet even here, women found leverage. Fragments of pottery from the Athenian state prison, scratched with names and dates, suggest some organized mutual aid networks pooling resources to buy freedom for one another, child by child. But not all female prisoners were victims. In Rome, the freedwoman turned prisoner Licinia became legendary among the Mamertine prison's inmates. Historical graffiti praises her as the matron of the dungeon, a title earned by turning her cell into a clandestine lending hub. Using smuggled coins, she financed escape attempts, bribed judges, and even funded a food-sharing system for starving prisoners. Her operation grew so powerful that guards reportedly ignored her, fearing the loyalty she commanded among both male and female inmates. Gender didn't just limit opportunities, it dictated them. In Tang Dynasty China, female convicts were funneled into state-run silk workshops, their delicate embroidery sold as imperial gifts. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, nuns imprisoned for heresy turned their cells into scriptoria, copying forbidden texts onto tiny scrolls hidden in prayer books, a trade that funded resistance movements. The contrast was stark. Where men might trade brute strength or metalwork, women exploited societal blind spots, leveraging crafts or caregiving roles to carve economic niches. Yet the most pernicious divide wasn't gender, it was race. Assyrian tablets distinguish between local and foreign female prisoners, with prices for their labor varying wildly. A Syrian weaver might fetch half the rate of a Babylonian one, while Nubian women in Egyptian jails were disproportionately assigned to brutal fieldwork. This hierarchy of profit mirrored the prejudices outside prison walls, proving captivity didn't erase societal divisions, it magnified them. The story of women in ancient prisons isn't just one of suffering. It's a testament to how the marginalized manipulated systems stacked against them, turning scraps into power. And as we'll see next, these unofficial economies didn't vanish when prison gates opened, they seeped into the streets, shaping criminal underworlds for centuries to come. Race and caste didn't just shape ancient societies, they built the very foundation of prison economies. In Mauryan India, the Arthashastra, a chillingly detailed manual of statecraft, classified prisoners by caste, assigning labor based on birthright. A Brahmin might copy sacred texts in relative comfort, while a Shudra toiled in quarries under the whip. But the real cruelty lay in the profits. High caste prisoners could buy privileges, better food, softer bedding, while low caste inmates were leased out like livestock, their labor enriching local landowners. A surviving ledger from Patalapatra lists Shudra convicts traded for seasonal fieldwork, their worth calculated in measures of grain. The system didn't just punish, it monetized prejudice. Egypt's quarries told a similar story. Papyrus records from the reign of Ramses III reveal Nubian prisoners singled out for the deadliest work, hauling stones under the desert sun. Their rations were half those of Egyptian convicts, their mortality rates shockingly high. Yet the same scrolls note how overseers pocketed the saved food budgets, selling the excess to merchants. Meanwhile, Syrian and Libyan prisoners deemed less expendable were assigned to skilled tasks like carving hieroglyphics, their work fetching higher prices in temple markets. Racism wasn't just systemic, it was a pricing strategy. Rome took this brutality to sea. Galley ships, the empire's naval backbone, relied on a grim hierarchy. Germanic rowers at the bottom, chained to oars until their hands bled. Greek navigators slightly above them, valued for their knowledge of currents. And North African prisoners, often former sailors, forced to train new rowers under threat of execution. A 1st century ship manifest recently recovered off Sicily lists rowers by origin and output, with prices adjusted for ethnicity, proof that even suffering had a sliding scale. The parallels to modern systems are impossible to ignore. From the convict leasing that replaced American slavery to the racial disparities in today's prison labor wages, the pattern persists, oppression tailored to maximize profit from marginalized bodies. Ancient ledgers and modern spreadsheets share the same cold logic, calculating human value by the biases of those in power. But the darkest chapter of this story unfolded during war, when prisons transformed into full-blown wartime industries. When empires clashed, it wasn't just soldiers who fought, it was prisoners who fueled the machines of conquest. War transformed prisons into factories of conquest, where the clang of chains kept pace with the rhythm of military production. Take Carthage's prisoner of war camps after the Battle of Himera in 480 before the Common Era. Thousands of captured Greek soldiers weren't just imprisoned, they were put to work forging the very weapons that would subjugate their homelands. Greek historian Diodorus Siculus describes foundries inside the camps, where Sicilian craftsmen, shackled at ankle and wrist, smelted bronze into spearheads under the watch of Carthaginian overseers. The irony was brutal. These men knew their labor would arm the next wave of invaders, yet refusal meant execution. One account tells of a prisoner who deliberately flawed a batch of arrowheads, only to be crucified with a sign reading, "Traitor to his captors, traitor to his people." The message was clear. In war, even resistance could be turned into a tool of terror. Rome perfected this grim calculus. After crushing the Gaulish revolt led by Vercingetorix, Caesar paraded 50,000 prisoners through Rome, not just as trophies but as inventory. His own writings boast how these captives rebuilt roads and fortifications in record time, their labor accelerating Rome's march into Germania. But the real innovation came in the mines. Spanish silver deposits seized from Carthage were worked entirely by POWs, their output funding legions that stretched the empire from Britain to Babylon. A ledger from the Rio Tinto mines lists monthly quotas, so many ingots per prisoner, with shortfalls punished by reduced rations. The system was so efficient that during the Dacian Wars, Trajan used captured soldiers to construct his iconic bridge across the Danube, a marvel of engineering built by enslaved hands. Thucydides exposes the strategic genius behind this exploitation. In his account of the Peloponnesian War, he notes how Sparta's decision to spare Athenian prisoners after the Battle of Sphacteria wasn't mercy, it was economics. By forcing them to quarry marble for Spartan monuments, they demoralized Athens while enriching themselves. The historian dryly observes, "Why kill enemies when their living hands fill your coffers?" This cold pragmatism spread like a virus. When Alexander the Great sacked Tyre, he didn't massacre its defenders. He sent them to the Egyptian desert to quarry stone for Alexandria, turning their skills against their own allies. As empires expanded, so did their prison industrial complexes. The Mongols under Genghis Khan institutionalized the practice, with Chinese engineers captured at Zhongdu forced to build siege engines that would later reduce their own cities to rubble. Persian scrolls from the Ilkhanate describe how Armenian archers, taken prisoner during invasions, were compelled to craft bows for Mongol cavalry weapons that would then be used to slaughter their kinsmen. The cruelty had a purpose. It broke collective spirit while maximizing resources. But the most chilling evolution came when these systems crossed oceans. Spanish conquistadors, schooled in the Reconquista's slave prison camps, replicated them in the Americas. Indigenous warriors captured in battle were sent to hellish silver mines like Potosi, where their suffering bankrolled Europe's Renaissance. A ledger from 1542 records over 4,000 Quechua prisoners processing ore, their mortality rate so high that fresh captives were shipped monthly to replace the dead. This wasn't just conquest, it was globalization of human misery, with prison labor as the engine. From Carthage to the New World, war prisons became self-perpetuating machines. Capture enemies to build weapons, use those weapons to capture more enemies. The cycle fed empires until the earth itself seemed to groan under its weight. Yet even in this darkness, seeds of change were stirring not from the conquerors, but from the conquered, who would turn the tools of their oppression into instruments of rebellion. When Spanish galleons first crossed the Atlantic, they carried more than conquistadors and crosses. They brought an ancient blueprint for turning human suffering into profit. The silver mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia became ground zero for this colonial horror show, where indigenous prisoners toiled in tunnels so deep, some never saw daylight again. But here's what history books often miss. This wasn't innovation, it was recycling. The Spanish simply dusted off the Roman playbook, replacing European convicts with Quechua and Aymara captives, their labor fueling an empire's greed. A ledger from 1574 records the grim math. For every ton of silver extracted, 6 prisoners died from mercury poisoning or tunnel collapses. The mines became such efficient slaughterhouses that Spanish priests wrote to the crown, warning that entire cultures were being erased, not out of compassion, but fear that the labor supply would vanish. Yet the Spanish weren't alone in this brutal trade. The Portuguese turned Brazil's prisons into sugarcane factories, where indigenous and African prisoners crushed cane under armed guard, their sweat sweetening Europe's tea. Dutch East India Company records from Java detail corrective labor camps for locals who resisted spice monopolies. Prisoners forced to harvest nutmeg and cloves under whips, their output shipped to Amsterdam auctions. The British perfected the system in Australia, where convicts transported from London built roads and ports that later enriched free settlers. Colonialism didn't just exploit land, it weaponized incarceration as a tool of economic extraction. The parallels to earlier empires are chilling. Like the Mongols pressuring Chinese engineers to build siege engines, the Spanish coerced Aztec stonemasons to construct cathedrals atop their own temples' rubble. Both systems shared a cynical logic: break spirits while maximizing output. But colonialism added a racist twist. Where ancient empires often valued prisoners for their skills, Assyrian scribes, Roman metalworkers, European colonists dismissed indigenous knowledge, treating captives as brute labor. A Spanish mine supervisor's journal from Potosi boasts about replacing lazy natives with African slaves, only to backtrack when the slaves died faster from altitude sickness. Human life had become a disposable variable in a profit equation. The economic scars never faded. Modern Bolivian miners still chant to El Tío, a devilish statue guarding the mines, a folkloric remnant of colonial terror. In Australia, studies trace wealth gaps between convict-descended communities and free settlers back to those first lopsided labor systems, the true cost. Generations of stolen labor, cultures fractured by forced systems, and economies built on the lie that progress requires human sacrifice, and who reaped the benefits. Not just distant kings, but the everyday enablers of empire, merchants, priests, even artists. Next, we'll follow the silver from Potosi's hellish tunnels to the gilded salons of Madrid, where prison profits funded Renaissance splendor while the miners' bones piled up in unmarked pits. The gleaming marble statues that adorned Roman villas, the rich purple robes of emperors, even the jewel-toned stained glass in medieval cathedrals, these symbols of luxury shared a dark secret. Their beauty was extracted through the suffering of imprisoned hands. Take Tyrian purple, the most coveted dye in antiquity, produced from the mucus of sea snails. Ancient texts describe how prisoners in Sidon's coastal prisons were forced to harvest thousands of mollusks, their fingers rotting from constant exposure to salt water and decaying flesh. A single ounce of dye required crushing 12,000 snails, a process so foul-smelling that workshops were built downwind of cities. Yet this revolting labor produced a color so valuable, it became synonymous with power: royal tunics, senatorial stripes, even the veil of Jerusalem's temple, all flowed from the misery of those chained workhouses. Even grand architecture owed its splendor to captivity. The Parthenon's flawless columns, quarried by Athenian prisoners in the Pentelicon mines, where surviving graffiti shows men marking their sentences in stone. One inscription reads, 3 years left, beside a crude sundial. Michelangelo's David began as a block of Carrara marble hauled by convicts from Tuscany's mountains, their ankles scarred by iron shackles still visible in museum records. The Vatican's obelisk, weighing over 300 tons, was transported by hundreds of enslaved laborers under Nero's rule, a feat so deadly that Renaissance artists depicted the event with skeletons pulling ropes. The ethics troubled even ancient observers. Philosopher Seneca recoiled at dining on silver plates mined by men who looked like corpses, while rabbinic texts debated whether Tyrian purple could be worn for prayer, given its tainted origins. Yet the trade flourished because financial systems insulated elites from the human cost. Roman bankers advanced loans to quarry owners with prisoners as collateral, while medieval guilds sold ethical certificates claiming their purple came from free laborers, a hollow fiction, as tax rolls reveal most dyers purchased bulk shipments from prison workshops. This disconnect between luxury and suffering was no accident. It was engineered. Merchant ledgers from Venice show how middlemen deliberately obscured supply chains, listing prison-mined lapis lazuli as Persian blue to ease aristocratic consciences. The same obfuscation happens today. How many smartphone buyers consider the cobalt mined by Congolese prisoners in their devices? From ancient Rome to modern capitalism, the game remains unchanged. Distance the privileged from the pain that enables their comfort, and profit will always find a way. The first banks in human history weren't just temples of wealth, they were silent partners in the prison trade. In Mesopotamia, where banking began, clay tablets from detail loans issued to prisoners' families with chilling terms. One such contract, dated to around 2100 before the Common Era, lists a barley loan to the wife of a debtor held in the city's infamous House of Darkness. The interest, a staggering 33%, payable in monthly installments. If she defaulted, the tablet coldly notes her children would be seized as collateral. These weren't isolated cases. Banking archives from Babylon overflow with records of prison-adjacent lending advances for bribes, loans to cover court fees, even credit lines for guards willing to smuggle in comforts. The system was designed to ensnare. A prisoner might borrow to buy freedom, only to find the debt's weight drag them back inside. But the real innovation was in collateralization. Assyrian banks accepted prisoners themselves as loan security. A merchant could pledge his incarcerated brother as guarantee for a trading venture. If the deal failed, the bank claimed the prisoner's remaining sentence, leasing him out to labor camps. The math was brutal, human lives reduced to lines in ledgers, their suffering compounding like interest. Even kings participated. A Nineveh tablet records Emperor Sennacherib's treasury issuing loans to jailers, using future prisoner labor as repayment. The message was clear: incarceration wasn't just punishment, it was a financial instrument. The parallels to modern systems are unsettling. Like payday loans targeting cash-strapped families today, ancient lenders preyed on the desperate. A Babylonian tablet describes a rolling debt trap. A fisherman jailed for unpaid taxes took a loan to cover his release, then another to pay the first loan's interest, cycling deeper into bondage. Sound familiar? It mirrors today's prison industrial complex, where bail bondsmen and court fees create modern debtors' prisons. The tools have changed: electronic transfers instead of clay receipts, but the mechanics remain eerily similar. Yet these systems weren't invincible. The decline began with a surprising force: religious reform. Hebrew law in the 7th century before the Common Era banned interest-bearing loans to fellow Israelites, disrupting the prison debt machine. Later, Athenian democrats like Solon outlawed debt slavery, freeing thousands from perpetual incarceration. Even Hammurabi's famous code, despite its harshness, included debt forgiveness decrees acknowledging the system's corrosive grip. The death knell came from an unexpected quarter: empire building. As Rome expanded, its leaders realized mass imprisonment hampered productivity. Why lock up skilled laborers when you could tax them? Augustus shifted punishment toward fines and public works, starving the old prison banking networks. By the 1st century, Roman financiers saw prisoners as liabilities, not assets. A seismic shift in economic thought. But history never truly breaks its chains. Today's private probation companies charging fees for ankle monitors, or prisons charging inmates for phone calls, prove the ancient template endures. The clay tablets may be gone, but the ledger of exploitation remains open. And just as these systems faded, another force emerged, one that would reshape prisons entirely: the rise of religious institutions as jailers. Monasteries, mosques, and temples didn't just house the condemned. They weaponized salvation itself as a tool of control. Even the most ruthless prison economies eventually crumbled, not from moral awakenings, but from their own unsustainable greed. Rome's collapse offers the starkest lesson. By the 3rd century, the empire's silver mines were so dependent on convict labor that when plague ravaged the prison camps, production plummeted by 60%. Tax records showed desperate officials pleading with the Senate to replenish workers, warning that without fresh prisoners, the legions wouldn't get paid. But the cracks ran deeper. Slave revolts like Spartacus' Uprising had exposed the system's fragility. Entire regions paralyzed when the enslaved stopped working. By the time Goths sacked Rome in 410, the empire had hollowed itself out, its wealth built on a pyramid of human suffering that finally buckled under its own weight. Yet some societies learned to adapt. In Byzantium, Emperor Justinian's 6th century reforms banned private prisons and limited hard labor to genuine criminals, not debtors. His legal code explicitly stated that no man shall profit from another's captivity, a radical notion at the time. Prisoners were given basic wages for state work, and corrupt guards faced flogging. The change wasn't altruism, it was pragmatism. Byzantine ledgers reveal how earlier abuses had sparked constant riots, draining military resources. After reforms, productivity in imperial workshops actually increased, proving exploitation wasn't just cruel, it was inefficient. But did these systems really die or just shapeshift? Medieval Europe offers troubling answers. When the Black Death wiped out half the continent's workforce in the 1300s, lords repurposed old Roman laws to force survivors into contract labor, a thinly disguised revival of prison slavery. Venice's infamous lead prison kept glassmakers captive to protect trade secrets, while Spanish wool mills used judicial sentences as cover for industrial serfdom. The mechanisms grew subtler, but the pattern endured. Punishment and profit still entwined like vines on a prison wall. Today's echoes are impossible to ignore. From private prisons charging inmates for basic necessities to corporations exploiting prison labor for pennies an hour, the ancient playbook remains disturbingly relevant. The difference: our chains are now spreadsheets and legal loopholes. Perhaps the real lesson isn't that these systems fell, it's that they learned to hide in plain sight. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the echoes of ancient prison economies still reverberate through modern correctional facilities. In the United States, the 13th Amendment's infamous loophole allowing slavery as punishment for a crime paved the way for chain gangs in the early 1900s, where black prisoners in the South were leased to plantations and railroads under brutal conditions. Today, private prisons like Core Civic and Geo Group profit from inmate labor, paying workers as little as 12 cents an hour to manufacture everything from military helmets to fast food packaging. The business model would feel chillingly familiar to a Roman quarry overseer. Human suffering commodified, with profits funneled to shareholders rather than senators. Activists like the Prison Policy Initiative have exposed how these systems perpetuate cycles of exploitation. In Louisiana's Angola prison, a former plantation where most inmates are black, men still pick cotton under armed guard, some earning just 4 cents an hour. Meanwhile, corporations like Walmart and Victoria's Secret have faced lawsuits for using prison labor to avoid fair wages, echoing the Tang Dynasty's state-run silk workshops. The key difference: modern companies outsource the brutality, hiding behind subcontractors to maintain plausible deniability, yet resistance is growing. Organizations like the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee have coordinated nationwide prison strikes demanding living wages, while legislation like California's Proposition 22 seeks to classify incarcerated workers as employees rather than property of the state. These battles mirror ancient struggles: Byzantine prisoners bargaining for better rations, or Babylonian debtors forming solidarity networks, proving that the fight for dignity behind bars is as old as incarceration itself. So who profits most today? Follow the money. From the $2 billion in annual revenue generated by prison labor, to the politicians funded by private prison lobbyists, to the corporations that save millions by avoiding fair wages. The players have changed, but the game remains the same. As we approach our final reckoning with this dark legacy, consider this: if history shows us anything, it's that systems built on exploitation inevitably crumble under their own weight. but only when the oppressed find the power to shake the foundations. Behind every ancient prison economy stood a pyramid of profiteers, each tier feeding off the suffering below. At the base were the guards, the petty tyrants with hands in every transaction. Roman jailers in the Mamertine prison could double their annual wages through bribes alone, according to tax records unearthed near the Forum. A single wax tablet lists one guard's monthly take: 15 silver denarii from smuggling wine, 8 from forged release papers, even 2 from renting out his own cloak as bedding. Yet these men were small players compared to the merchants who weaponized supply chains. Syrian traders near Antioch's prisons operated like shadow corporations, charging tenfold markups on essentials like lamp oil or bandages. A Pomeran merchant's ledger from the 2nd century boasts profits so vast, he purchased a vineyard after just 2 years of selling dates to prison workshops. But the real architect sat higher up. Roman senators like Crassus didn't just own slaves, they invested in prisons as real estate ventures. Papyrus records from Egypt reveal how prefects like Tiberius Julius Alexander leased out entire prison blocks to private contractors, skimming profits from inmate labor. The numbers stagger. One Alexandrian prison generated 600 gold solidi annually from weaving alone, enough to fund a legion for months. Religious institutions perfected this exploitation with divine branding. The Temple of Isis in Memphis ran a penitence quarry where prisoners mined limestone sold as blessed stone, its price inflated by priestly blessings. A stele outside Thebes brags how temple prisons funded 3 new shrines through the pious labors of the wayward. Yet quantifying who benefited most depends on how we measure gain. Guards enjoyed immediate cash but risked flogging if caught. Merchants built lasting wealth but relied on corruptible middlemen. Elites and clergy reaped both money and power. Augustus famously used prison labor to rebuild Rome after civil wars, cementing his reputation as a restorer while lining aristocratic pockets. The system wasn't designed so much as evolved, a Frankenstein of opportunism where each player exploited fractures in justice. Did prisoners ever truly win? Rarely, but when they did, it was through collective cunning. The Sicilian Revolts Chinese letter success proved mass defiance could shake empires, while individual victories were quieter but no less remarkable. A Byzantine mosaic in Thessaloniki depicts an unnamed prisoner who smuggled out designs for his inventions, a water-powered mill that later revolutionized local farms. His reward, a pardon and a workshop, though history notes the mill's profits mostly flowed to the local bishop. What lessons echo across millennia? That systems built on human misery invariably rot from within. Rome's prison-driven silver mines collapsed when revolts disrupted supply chains. Spanish colonists bankrupted Potosi by working prisoners to death faster than replacements arrived. Exploitation, it seems, is a self-defeating strategy, one we've yet to unlearn. As modern corporations replicate these ancient models, the question isn't just who profits, but who will finally break the cycle. The shadow economies of ancient prisons weren't anomalies, they were blueprints. From the quarries of Rome to the silver mines of Potosi, these systems weren't built on oversight or neglect. They were meticulously designed to extract value from human suffering. Every whispered trade in a Babylonian cell, every coin pocketed by a corrupt guard, every ledger tallying prisoners like livestock, all of it points to a truth we still grapple with today. Exploitation isn't a bug in the system. It is the system. The philosopher Seneca saw it clearly 2,000 years ago, watching Rome's elites feast while prisoners choked on mine dust. No cruelty can last unless profit fuels it. That cruelty didn't vanish with togas and triremes. Look closer at modern supply chains, and you'll find the same patterns hiding in plain sight. Prisoners in the American South still harvest cotton for multinational brands. Chinese labor camps produce goods sold on global markets. Even your smartphone might contain cobalt mined by Congolese convicts. The players have changed, but the game remains eerily familiar. Power still profits when justice becomes a commodity. So what can we do? Start by pulling threads. Research which companies use prison labor in your country. Check if your local taxes fund private prisons. Share stories like the Byzantine scribes who smuggled truth out of their cells, because sunlight is still the best disinfectant. History doesn't just repeat, it echoes, waiting for us to disrupt the cycle. As the old Assyrian proverb warns, chains forgotten are chains reforged. Let's prove them wrong.